All right, let's get into it. We're back again. This week we've been reading Fixing Broken Windows by George Kelling and Catherine Cole. It's a very nice book. I just finished it. And the book is about community policing, fundamentally, in America. And more specifically, the evolution of police departments across the United States and how they've contributed to social cohesion in America. And how they were developed, some criticisms, and how they can do better. So, in the book, it's a very simple philosophy. They state that crime is a constitution of our society and the disorder that we allow to be prevalent in that society. So, what does that mean? Well, smaller and more less violent crime, petty crime, contributes to the perception of the society in which that crime is happening. And if criminals see petty crime being allowed to flourish, then they will feel emboldened with which to commit more serious crimes, and society will devolve. Okay, it will snowball in a negative way. And that's not good. So they discuss how that's happened. Prior to the early 1900s, I'm just going to speak broadly. I'm not going to give you exact dates because I can't remember them. Prior to the 1900s, police were more enforcers. That's what I've come to understand. They were more rough, more coat jacket types rather than uniformed officers. And they would intimidate criminals into not committing crime rather than investigating crime. So reformers sought to change the way crime was investigated and crime was punished. And they developed the criminal justice system, which you recognise today if you've ever watched a crime show in the States, and ours here in Australia is similar. Fundamentally, you have three main areas of criminal justice. You have the police on the front lines that actually collect the criminals and investigate the crimes. And you have the justice system, which convicts or doesn't convict depending on the trial, the outcomes of the trial. And you have the punitive system, I believe it's called, the jails, okay, the prisons that hold the prisoners and the offenders of the crime. So prior to the system, there was a lot of corruption. A lot of corruption. Politicians had a lot of sway with police, and police were weaponized, or at the very least, they were used in such a way as to allow crime to happen in certain areas. So certain places like the docks were off limits. You know that for TV shows, the police officers, they either um, protect the docks from reporters or they just don't go there. That's based off of real stories. So they'd be fed money under the table and by the politicians, or most likely the politicians, councillors, things like that, people who were not good people. And that's the way it was until it was reformed. So um, during that time, there were statesmen and head of police commissions around the states who were trying to fix this problem. And they were trying to give a more dignified embodiment of what a police officer should be. So they were developing and drafting arguments for what society should look like and the police's role in that society. And they were using academics as help to try and craft that in good faith. Okay, so it was really about the citizens' perception of police, the public's perception of police. So what they did was they developed a system where police would patrol rather, sorry. They would patrol certain areas called a beat, and they would walk around certain area blocks and patrol for crime. And they would look out for things like broken windows and graffiti and small petty thefts and things like that. And they would investigate more serious crime as it would arise, but most of the time on their beat while they were patrolling, they'd be moving people along, migrants that were causing mayhem, sleeping on sidewalks and things like that, and begging for money. Okay, they'd move those people along for a while as well. So that was what they developed, and the corollary of that. Okay, the consequence of that development was that the police officers in those beats, because they were your beat was your path, so you wouldn't stray from your patrol. You if you're an officer, that'd be your main route every shift, whatever the shifts were. And the corollary of that during that time is that the police would come to know the residents and the neighbours and the community folk within that beat, and they would develop a rapport with the members of those societies. And if anything wrong occurred, they would be communicating back and forth with community leaders amongst those routes and in those communities. And they had really positive results. Community leaders and citizens felt connected to the police officers. They felt calm and secure in their own neighbourhoods. And there was peace. Children would flourish and walk around with gumdrop smiles. Okay, that type of stuff. So it was quite interesting to read that. Now, they've done surveys, and across all demographics, people agree on what disorder is, and it can be defined very simply as conduct which contributes negatively to the neighbourhood in which you're a part of. Can be small, can be large, but fundamentally, anything that contributes poorly to the environment around you is disorder. All demographics agree on that definition. All demographics agree that they would feel more comfortable going outside if their streets were clean and they weren't harassed by vagrants asking them for money. They've done surveys, and across all demographics, they found that people were less inclined to contribute to their society and to their community if the community didn't look good, if the community was falling apart, if there was disorder. They'd be less inclined to contribute and they'd be more fearful. Okay, so in areas where crime was prevalent, people were more fearful that crime would eventually happen to them. And in the states where that has happened, people have systematically fled from those areas, okay, across history. Periodically, if crime is allowed to run rampant, people flee, okay, because they don't want to live there, because it's not a nice place to live anymore. There's too much crime happening and there's disorder, okay, and their children, they don't feel comfortable letting their children walk around outside. So those were the surveys they took when they tried to undertake this task, and the results were really positive. There was less graffiti, less broken windows, and less vagrants walking around. Now, some lobby groups didn't like that. There were very large movements around the time that these theories were being introduced that were pushing back on it because of the perception they thought that this theory had across some of the less affluent communities. Okay, so they made an assumption that this attempt to clean up the society, to clean up your community, was singling out some of the less affluent members, so the homeless and poor people. And they never mention that those people were committing the crimes. They just say that the police were unfairly targeting the poor and the homeless. Okay, and that's what they turned the argument into, and they made it about the First Amendment. So fundamentally, in periods like panhandling, begging on the streets, and things like that, they'd say that was a fundamental right to express your opinion, and your opinion was something like, "I need money" or something. So there were lobby groups pushing back on that, and they, in some instances, they were able to achieve their end, and police were no longer allowed to move homeless along. Okay, which they had some status laws in. So if you was part of a status like homeless or poor or something, okay, the police officer couldn't enforce any of these policies without due cause. Okay, you had to actually be committing some crime, and panhandling wasn't one of them. Okay, begging wasn't one of them anymore. They had to be committing some other crime. They weren't allowed to move people along anymore who were laying down on sidewalks and things like that. And so in the book, they point out that not everyone who commits these petty offences are homeless and poor. Okay, there are many people who, in fact, the majority of the people who were vagrant-esque types and causing quote-unquote trouble in those communities had homes. They were abusing drugs or they were criminals. Okay, a lot of the police who, when these people had committed crimes and the police officers grabbed them and checked their record, lo and behold, they were previous offenders. So that's interesting. And the argument in the book is that, most poor people obey the law and pay their taxes just like everyone else. It's only a very small number of people who are committing all of the crime, and you know, that's still prevalent to the area. That's the Pareto distribution, right? So 6% of all young people, I think it is, commit like over 50% of the crime between the ages of 17 and 21 or something. And that's crazy. Okay. So a very small proportion of offenders commit all of the crime. Okay. That's always been the case. Lobbyists didn't care about those sort of statistics. They um, just painted the picture with a broad brushstroke and attempted to get them to reform. So they did reform again, and they stopped being allowed to move vagrants along and push the homeless out and things like that. And in those societies, San Francisco was the main one, and funnily enough, crime just went out of control in those areas. So real interesting. You wouldn't think that would happen, um, you know, with the reformers making the case that these homeless people and poor people were all um, sort of vestal spirits that wouldn't harm a fly. I'm not really sure why that had happened, but it did. So that was what happened. And when police were stopped being allowed to um, do their job and move along vagrants and stop people begging for money, crime just got out of control. So that's interesting. Now, also during that time, the automobile was invented, the car, right? And police officers were given patrol cars. And there were academics again, this time working at the behest of lobby groups, who made the case, and police commissioners again, that officers should be more refined again. So the first time they cleaned them up, gave them the uniforms, and got them to walk a patrol. Now they had their cars and they were developing the 911 system, and their argument was police need to be more refined. Okay, they shouldn't be concerning themselves with the small sort of vicissitudes of the community. They were to fight crime. They were crime fighters. They were to focus on the big and serious crimes because that's the job of a police officer, to stand on the front line and be the first person investigating these crimes. Now, it wasn't all that bad as I'm making it out because that argument did have a positive effect on police work. So they were making a case that officers should be educated and more refined and articulate um, and investigating crime. So in adjacent with that, laws were being developed that were preventing officers from searching vehicles without probable cause. Okay, they were developing that law and needing warrants for suspected evidence, and they needed to get a conviction without, I don't know the lawyer, so not a lawyer, but without reasonable doubt, essentially. So before that, a lot of the police officers were focusing on interrogation. Interrogation was the um, biggest percentage of solved cases, where the coppers would get them in the room, and they'd, come on, man, what did you do? Tell us what you've done, and it'll all be all right. And by all right, they mean go to jail or whatever. But um, that's the type of stuff that was happening. So those laws being introduced and policies developed allowed police to investigate more thoroughly these cases and get convictions other than interrogation, other than a confession out of the suspect. They were able to convict on evidence and things like that. So they were developing really refined investigative tactics, and that was a result of reformation in American law and the development of new policy in place. So that's quite positive. So some of the things they say in the book do have a really positive effect on police, but things like the perception that the police were only crime fighters and they weren't sort of to resolve with the smaller issues really was problematic, especially for the communities, because if originally they were investigating things like broken windows and panhandling and smaller problems in society, petty theft and things like that, and then they were transitioning to be more crime fighters, more like homicide investigators, and specifically, all these big issues. Who was left to deal with those smaller problems? Nobody is the answer, and that's precisely what happened. So a lot of the smaller problems went um, unrepaired, unsolved, and crime really flourished as a result because there was no one patrolling anymore. They'd have a patrol car and they'd do a route, but apparently the conviction rate for police in patrol cars was really low. So the largest conviction rate was police responding to calls that they would get through the 911 system, okay, and not through the patrol itself. You always see in the television shows where the police just happen to drive by at a certain time, and maybe that can occur with um, some car offences, speeding and things like that, but most of the time it's response through the 911 system. And that was really problematic for the small issues in the community, and that had a really bad effect on a lot of communities over there. So again, when smaller issues go unnoticed and unresolved, it really impacts the community in a negative way. That contributes to the perception of what the society is that we're living in. Those smaller issues might seem like really small and petty and insignificant, but they build up over time. And all of a sudden, over a few years, you've got a slum neighborhood because nobody's attending to the smaller issues. Um, it might be easy to blame the citizens that they should be attending to these issues as well, and they should be sort of not allowing these things to happen. But they really were driving the perception that civilians were to be sort of good eyewitnesses and not to interfere in these sort of criminal matters. That was for police only. They were trying to develop a singular sort of team and unified response with the police system, and they were saying, no, it's our duty, it's our responsibility to protect all civilians, and that's precisely what we're going to do. And um, it's not for the civilians to they're just going to get in the way. They're not trained, they're not equipped, and they could get hurt, and they could impact an investigation in a negative way. So they really did create that perception that civilians were to stay out of it, and so that's what happened. Over time, with a lot of these smaller issues, it really did impact in a negative way. So San Francisco is not in a good state, and California apparently. I haven't been there, but that's what I hear down the trickle vine. And a lot of reformation laws and responses to these smaller issues are at least contributing to those problems. So I know there are other problems as well, like the incentivization structure with government funded programs like homeless shelters and things like that. They're incentivized to they're incentivized in the wrong way. So you get more money the more homeless people you deal with and not how many you actually help. So that might seem like an insignificant incentive, but um, if you've got any industry, like if you get paid on how many um, pieces of bread you sell rather on the quality, then you're going to bake as many loaves as possible in the shortest amount of time. And that's not what you're being paid for. You're being paid for quality and not for quantity and not quality. And so you might not think that happens in government organizations. It happens in government organizations. It happens all the time. And so that's another contributing factor there. So a lot of these things were happening in unison, and they were responses to new developments and new technology that was emerging within America and in the police units. There are a lot of commissioners that came in really trying to drive change in their departments. Some of the departments had bad raps, like for corruption issues and things like that in certain states, some more than others. And some people really came in with a positive attitude and tried to change that. And they were having these complex discussions at a state community level and even at a national level. And they were sort of using test cases from other states to inform their own on how to develop their own responses to the problems that was happening for them. And it was all unique and different and diverse. And it was super interesting to read about. And these things developed over a course of a very long time. And the modern structure today, um, in the book, they argue, we should be focusing on smaller issues and we're really not. And that's the case they make. And, the most recent one in the book, it was written a few years ago, but the most recent one they used was New York and the Mayor Giuliani, which is, you probably heard that name before. He's quite a famous mayor in the 90s. And he was working with the police commissioner to really try and clean up New York. New York had a big problem with vagrancy in the parks, in Central Park, and I forget the name of the other one, Bryant Park or something, I think, and problems on subways and things like that. And people were afraid to go outside and walk around in the community. New York City had devolved into, you know, something, an urban wasteland of sorts where people were unwilling to walk outside and flourish because there was too much crime happening and people were allowed to, walk around unchecked and harass everyday citizens. And so they really made a concerted effort to try and clean up New York, and they stopped allowing homeless people between 7 and 10 sleeping on park benches around the parks and had them move along. And they had a really positive effect, and specifically the subways, big problems on subways. They had lots of graffiti. Graffiti was a large contributor, so they'd spent millions trying to fix up graffiti and it just wasn't working. And they ended up making a partnership with the transit authorities and the metro section departments of the police and the and some of the business district as well, even all worked in unison. So the business districts would hire independent security and private sector guards to patrol the surface level areas above subways, and all the metro people would patrol the subways themselves and try and prevent crime there, like harassment and panhandling and things like that. And um, in terms of the graffiti, all of the subway cars which had graffiti on them, they'd change out any new subway car. They were very diligent. They'd change out a new one with new graffiti in it straight away and bring it to the yard and be cleaned. And they'd have some, I think, in a yard where they just let one or two where it was just they'd never take them out, but they were the ones allowed to be graffitied. And then everything else had to be brand new and stripped of any graffiti that was on them instantly as soon as they'd noticed. And it worked. The graffiti people stopped graffitiing because they were like, well, my art is gone the next day. It's like it's a redundant exercise. They were making a diligent effort to really try and focus on these smaller issues, and it had positive effects everywhere. People were riding the subway again and happy and walking about, and they weren't being harassed, for money every now and again, everywhere they went. And these things were so in 1995, I think they implemented it, And from 1995 down to 98 and 99, they had crime reductions all over the city, all through the subway sections, all through the metro tunnels, all over the city, because they made a real diligent effort to focus on these smaller. That's all they were doing. They weren't focusing on bigger crimes. They already have departments alive doing that because of the system that they've developed. They were making a concerted effort to focus on smaller crimes, and crime went down as a result. Now, why is that? What they found is people who didn't pay fares for subways, they reformed the law saying it like a strike, like a 3-strike system. If you had unpaid fines, you were allowed to be arrested by police. Originally, it wasn't like that. Okay, it was just you get a fine if you were caught not paying the fare on the subway, and people would bring their tickets, their unpaid tickets, into the subway for officers, and they taunt them with as the officer was writing them a new one. They go, "Yeah, and I've got this one too, and I just haven't paid it, because I don't. There's no consequences. There's no consequences for my action," and they'd be around taunting them. And so they changed that. They said if you have unpaid tickets, you can be arrested and charged. And what they found is the criminals who were caught who didn't pay their tickets, who had previously not paid their tickets and not paid their tickets this time, they found that those people had more weapons on them most of the time, had previously been convicted for more serious crime, like robbery, aggravated robbery, assault, sometimes homicide. There wasn't very many of them, very small percentage, but they had almost always committed previous crime before. Almost always the very small percentage that were, prolific in their non-paying fees and their smaller petty crime things like graffiti and things, previous records for more serious crime. Okay, so most of the people that every now and again you forgot your wallet or whatever, and you got a ticket and you paid it next time. Everyday people, citizens, were living their lives and obeying the law. A very small percentage were not, and they were committing all of the crime, and they were allowed to commit smaller crimes, which contribute to the social cohesion because everyone had the perception that smaller crime was not going checked, and so it all built up and cascaded in a negative way. Okay, it snowballed, and that's not good. So that's what was occurring. Same thing with squeegeeing. There was a big problem with squeegeeing. It's not so much a problem anymore in Australia because we're nearly a cashless society. I don't know anybody who walks around with cash. And so when I was growing up, there used to be heaps of them. They were all around squeegeeing. In New York, it was quite bad. And they made a concerted effort, again, to stop that. So they stopped people from squeegeeing. Now, some lobbyists were critical of this, saying, come on, they're just trying to get some bread or whatever, they're not harming anyone. Well, one of the commissioners or the police, someone in the state that was doing policy type work, him and his wife were driving through New York one time and they got stopped by a squeegeer. And they reflected on the moment and what it was, and they thought it was quite intimidating from the perspective of a driver because he didn't really have a choice and the person was quite manic. And if you didn't pay, they become quite aggressive. Okay, so it was a form of harassment. It was intimidating. And what they found is that when they'd attempted to clean up this squeegeeing problem, a lot of the squeegeers had previous convictions, aggravated assaults, robbery homicides, all these types of things, okay? They had weapons on them a lot of the time. Previous offenders, almost always the case. Small percentage committing all of the crime. And that's what they found. And they made a diligent effort to stop it, and crime went down in New York City over a 5-year period that this was implemented. It was a really good test case, and it worked. It worked wonders. Crime went down. More serious crime went down, not just petty crime like graffiti. Robberies went down in the business district. They had help from the private sector because the business district was coming to the very sobering realization that if their neighborhood and their communities looked like slum, people would be less inclined to go and walk around in there and spend money. And they needed to spend money. It was a business district. It was shops and malls and higher end things on the west side. So they made a concerted effort. They worked with police and they hired their own security and private um, workers to clean up the area, the community. And it worked wonders. It worked. And people were flourishing. They were happy. So it was a very interesting book to read. And I don't want to say too much about Australia because it is really a different society. It's a different society. Now, in Australia, we're understaffed with police. It was 100 per every 100,000, I think, and the average is 300 per 100, I think. Don't quote me, but I think I had a look the other day. I can't remember precisely, but Australia is undermanned in terms of police. Now, Australia is different, but one thing I want to say is about and the only thing I'm going to say, very problematic during COVID. Now, weaponization of police has happened in the past, but the degree to which the police were weaponized for political purposes during COVID was really sobering. It's not good. Now, 2 points on that. One, the police in Australia have a very similar perception about civilians than that the Americans did during this development of the refined policing. Okay, civilians are to be seen and not heard, and any civilian helping is impeding an investigation. Now, they were weaponized during COVID, and the only officers that were sensible, what I mean by that is were able to look at information critically, were dismissed during COVID because these are the officers that didn't get vaccinated. Now, those officers have been allowed to return to work, but I don't think many of them did. So all you're left with after COVID, during COVID, they weeded out all the officers with a bit of sense, and all that was left with was the bureaucrats, okay, the talking heads, the rule followers, and that's not good. They were weaponized, and the police officers were real happy beating up on everyday citizens in Australia, and it was some of the worst I've seen. Some of the videos that were coming out of some of the cops was crazy for things like not wearing a mask, and those that never got addressed. It's never been addressed, and that's not good in my opinion. That needs to be addressed. That the police were overbearing in their response. It was disproportionate. The response the police had was disproportionate to the problems that were occurring during COVID. Okay, like the lockdowns. Okay, it was a very minimal disease and didn't harm anybody. And the police, they were weaponized for political purposes, and that's not good. So that's all I really want to say about that. There's not that much of an issue with smaller problems in Perth, but there are no-go zones. Okay, there are like Islamic sites and things like that where you're not allowed to go. And it's the same in Melbourne and Sydney. There are no-go zones. And I imagine they probably look terrible. And there's probably a lot of really small problems that go unnoticed and unchecked. So that's interesting. It was a very interesting book. I quite enjoyed it. And man, it works. Like it's an ideological book in a sense because they talk about what they really want for a society in it. So it's ideological in that sense, but it's achievable in the same, because everybody wants a safe and happy community. They've done surveys across all demographics, even the less affluent people, even the people who, are acquaintances with criminals. They want a nice, healthy society where they don't feel fear walking outside into their neighborhood, okay? They don't want heavy drug users loitering about, and they don't want, petty, and they want to live in a clean space. Of course we do. Everybody wants this. But the only way you're going to solve that is if we work together with community leaders and police and really make a concerted effort like they did in New York. I don't know what it's like now. I hear murmurings that it's, they've got that crazy Islamic mayor, um, and I don't know what it's like, but the communist one. So they've got that, and San Francisco is a mess apparently. So the places where they've previously done it, reformers have come in and it's all turned to custard. So that's not good. Um, it's a shame because we shouldn't feel fear leaving our doorstep, and we shouldn't fear the police. And that's something that happened during COVID. We became fearful of the police, and the police are the ones that are supposed to protect us. Um, in England, the police are harming the proper citizens, the British people, and not the ones who are causing all of the damage and all of the harm. So it's all backwards, and that's not good. It's all twisted and backwards and upside down and topsy turvy, and they're arresting the wrong people. So that might happen here with the hate speech laws. Who knows? Because they're not arresting the people who commit the crime. They're arresting the people who are pointing out that crime is being committed and nothing's being done about it. So that's not good. And if they start arresting those people, then it'll all be upside down as well, just like the UK. And we don't want that. We want a nice, healthy, clean society. And it can be achieved, but people need to be honest about what's happening. And politicians aren't doing that because they're politicians and they're dishonest. So that's interesting. But I'd encourage people to read the book. It's a very easy read. There's only 250 pages. It's a small book. It's a standard book. It's a very easy read. I read 95% of it. Okay, I'm getting through them more or less. So that's good, and I enjoyed it. It was interesting and it was different. And I never really read anything. It was kind of legal in terms. They were using a lot of legal terms that I wasn't familiar with, and they were using a lot of legal cases that were used as precedents for new policy, which was interesting. It was a different way that I different from books that I normally read. So that was interesting. So there you go. Fixing broken windows. It's been implemented and it hasn't been implemented, and the communities where it's been implemented, the communities have done well. And when petty crime and smaller problems are allowed to go unchecked and unnoticed, crime flourishes, because of course it does. If you're in the darkness, darkness is going to peer back at you, as Nietzsche would say. So there you have it. Next week we're reading some philosophy. I never have the book with me. It's somewhere else. I'd have to get up to get it. But it's Walter Kaufman, and it's called Discovery of the Mind. It's 3 volumes. I'm only going to read the first one. And it might be over 3 weeks because it's split into 3 different people, but I don't know, I'll decide when I get into it. But that's going to be super interesting. It's semi-biographical, semi-philosophical, so talks about the thinkers and who they were, and a bit of context about where they were and what they were doing, and then a little bit about what their thoughts were and what their beliefs were and that type of stuff. So it's quite interesting. Walter Kaufman is a very good philosopher. People always overlook him, which is unfortunate. There's this going trope in philosophy that only the crazy ones get any recognition with their crazy theories. And that's a shame because a lot of the real sensible ones go unnoticed, and it's the sensible ones that are super interesting because they have the best insights. But they're just reasonable and simple insights that aren't sort of grandiose and utopianism. And so people find them boring, which is a shame. But I don't, so that's why I'm going to read them, and hopefully I'll try and interpret it in a way that's not boring, because that won't be much fun, will it? So there you go. Thanks for watching.